So to start things off, I think I'll ask the panel, tell us a bit about how you became an activist, however you understand that term, and how have you changed as an activist?
No, you go ahead. Unless I'm putting you on the spot.
No, it's fine. I can stay. So peace, everybody. Good night. So for me, I started at Make the Road by walking then, back in 1999. I was this 13-year-old kid, a little bit shorter than I am now, still skinny, still big ears. It was a moment where I had just received this little blue working card after graduating junior high school. And I tried to go up and down Myrtle and Knickerbocker Avenue to get a job and couldn't find anything. And so for some reason on one day when I hit Grove Street, I turned left. And I was kind of raised in Bushwick. I've been there all my life. Never turned left on Grove. And so I turned left and I ran into this organization that had all these beautiful images and spoke about community. And on top of all that, I peeked inside and saw two of my cousins having a conversation with this beautiful, big-haired Indian woman who's a mentor of mine, Una Chatterjee, who was one of the co-directors of the organization at the time. And when I entered that space, I overheard a small crew of young people engaging with Una about the lack of youth services in Bushwick, New York City. And of course, decided to kind of inject my opinions. Una, over the course of a few weeks, invited us back over and over and talked to us a lot about how that was a community space where she and Andrew and others were still thinking about, right, the kind of service, the kind of support, the kind of organizing they wanted to do in the city of New York. And that they've never thought about, right, like 13 and 14 and 15-year-olds driving and leading some of that work. And because we walked into that door, she wanted us to do that. And so the very first campaign I ever was a part of was a campaign called Wise Up, which was the team of young people organizing around youth services in Bushwick. And for about 6 months, we were calling on the Department of Education to increase funds for after-school programs and for other youth services in local communities that we knew, like Bushwick, were suffering, were completely ignored. And after those 6 months, we got the same thing we get year after year, right? There's no money, there's no money in the budget, there's no money. And then 6 months later, there was a flip of a mayor, and when Bloomberg came in during his first session, he had carried over a capital plan that Giuliani had talked about, and it was $64.6 million to expand Crossroads and Horizons youth jails. Two youth jails that weren't even at full capacity. They were at less than 70% capacity. And so for months, during our first campaign, we were asking for resources for good things, for after-school programs, for youth services. And somehow that money didn't exist, but magically $65 million appeared to build new jail beds that we knew were going to be filled. And so we pivoted our campaign at that moment and created a citywide coalition with other activists and other groups called the No More Youth Jails Coalition. It was my first coalition as a young activist at 14 years old. And after just shy of a year, we were able to remove 53 of the $64.6 million out of that capital pot. And for me, that was my marriage to this work, right? Just thinking about kind of a 14-year-old and a crew of 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds. And the fact that we were able to convince the city that an investment in youth jails was not an investment in our future was extremely powerful. And I've been at Make the Road ever since.
Yeah, I'll go next. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio in the last century. And when I was born, Jim Crow was absolutely the law and practice of the land. Even though I was growing up in a northern city, everybody in my family, except my twin sister and I, had been born in the Deep South. They came from Georgia, which was one of the worst states as far as racial violence and discrimination, oppression in the country. Very bloody record. Mississippi, of course, is generally considered to be the most extreme, but Georgia was right next to it as far as the severity. So even though then I grew up in the North, I was raised by Southerners who had a deep consciousness about what they had escaped and also what was occurring during my growing up years. I grew up during the civil rights era, and the things that people now study about or watch documentaries about or read about, I experienced those things in real time, primarily through the pretty new invention of television. Actually not new invention because it was actually, I think, invented in the 20s or 30s, but it became popularized and available for regular people to have during that time. So all of the things, as I said, that you see in documentaries or in films or whatever, were things that were the wallpaper of my growing up years. In Cleveland, we did have a strong civil rights movement, and a major focus of the civil rights movement in Cleveland by the time I was in high school was on de facto school segregation, not by law, but in practice. And the people who were organizing really made an effort to get young people involved, which to this day I thank them, because that was my entree into activism as a teenager, similar to you, except you found it, they found us, But what's important is that we were seen as valuable, that we had a valuable role to play. So they made a real effort to get young people involved in the school desegregation battle, because we were the people who were most directly affected by that reality. And unbeknownst to most people in this country to this day, Cleveland actually had a civil rights martyr who died because of his commitment to the struggle, the anti-racist struggle. He was a minister. His name was Reverend Bruce Clunder. He was quite young, I believe in his 20s. I'm quite sure in his 20s, when he was at the site of a school that was being built that would have perpetuated segregation. He lay down in the construction ditch, and the steam shovel backed over him. There are different accounts of the story, but in some accounts, they say the reason the steam shovel backed over him is that there were demonstrators in front of the steam shovel, and the driver did not want to enter them, and that the driver did not know that there was someone behind. He was killed instantly, and his name is engraved on the Civil Rights Memorial down at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. That, of course, heightened and catapulted the struggle to another level. The people in CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, local chapter, called for, and others called for, a citywide boycott of Cleveland public schools. And my sister and I, although we actually went to integrated schools, go figure, even though we were in integrated schools, we, of course, heeded the call, went to a demonstration for youth the Saturday before the school boycott on a Monday, and I had never felt like that before in my life. It was a feeling of incredible exhilaration, and also a feeling of people who were older than us actually looking at us as if we had something to contribute. So from that day to this, it was April of 1964, from that day to this, that's where I've been, and that's how I got involved. Thank you.
As Alethia was asking this question, my name's Joo-Hyun, and as Alethia was asking this question, I realized that I've been answering this question differently every single time I've been asked it, probably for the past bunch of years, mostly because I start to develop a new understanding of the question and my experiences. So the way I want to answer it tonight, if it's okay with you, is I got introduced to activism probably by my father growing up, who was very active in Korean immigrant work in New York, especially because there was a very small Korean immigrant community when we were first here. And part of that was really kind of traditional civic engagement of trying to get additional social services within the community, access to services, and that sort of thing. The part that is different for me around the way I think about my development is I got radicalized much later. So I, would go and do activist things with him and maybe even participate in other things that had nothing to do with my family. But really, I didn't get radicalized until probably my late teens, early 20s. And the story I want to tell with that is that it's actually partly the introduction of work that folks like Barbara did, whether it's the writings like the Combahee River Collective, which really is in many ways the precursor to what we call, or what a lot of people call intersectionality these days, I think, in terms of looking at what it really means to understand how to change systems of inequality and oppression by looking at it from the perspective of those who are most oppressed at the intersections of various systems. For me, some of that learning came from people around me. I met Barbara sometime probably in my 20s, maybe mid-20s. And the second piece of it, I think, was really being activated into spaces that were explicitly anti-capitalist, and learning a little bit more and trying to come to a better understanding of what it means to live in New York City, to live in the US, in a world that has such deep systems of inequality. And so one of the examples I would, that I think about that really made me fall in love with organizing and coalitions is in the mid-90s. When Rudy Giuliani was the mayor, one of the many years that he was doing budget cuts, but I think this was probably in 1995, was doing budget cuts across the board and planning them in healthcare and education. And it was a moment where, in the spring of 1995, something unprecedented happened, which was that there was a citywide shutdown of all the bridges and tunnels, but it was actually a coalition effort where people who were working with homeless people shut down one bridge, folks who were doing anti-police brutality work shut down another bridge, folks who were doing HIV and AIDS organizing shut down a tunnel, folks who did education work and were really protesting the CUNY cuts shut down another tunnel. And for me, that experience in some ways was my first, what I would call a serious eye-opening to what coalitions and bringing people together across difference could really do. Even though I think that since then I've probably changed some of my thinking in terms of what's the long-standing impact if we don't follow that up with additional action. But that's part of the story I would tell.
I want to move to a different question. I am going to come back to how have you changed as an activist over time. But first, I want to ask a question about history. The theme of tonight's conversation is about change, but it seems to me that so much about the fight for social change is about legacies and heritage. And I am curious if you could share with us how has the history of activism mattered to you? How do you understand yourself or your work in relationship to historical precedents and other social movements?
I'll answer that one first, if that's okay. And I don't think we're going to do, every single one's going to be the same order. I think people are okay with that, right? Well, it's great to find out that you're not the first person on the planet, or, in your nation, in your neighborhood, state, whatever, city, that thought, oh, there's something really, really wrong going on here. There's something really unjust going on here, and I think we should do something about it. Can't we do something about it? So knowing that history is really, really important. I think we draw inspiration from different chapters of it, but it's really important for us to have that sense of the lifeline of people who have spoken truth to power in horrible circumstances, generally, and yet have kept that light of activism burning and made it possible for you to exist as you exist right now, today. When people ask me why I don't get discouraged about activism and about political, current political realities, I talk about the fact that because my heritage is that of being an enslaved African in what became the United States, that's my heritage, that's why I'm here today, because of that history, that if anybody had asked at any point during the centuries of chattel slavery, the worst version of slavery that existed in human history as far as we understand, because it was not a status that you could escape from. Other societies enslaved people, but there were ways of changing one's status as enslaved, and in the United States, that wasn't happening. But in any event, if you ask the question, will these people ever be free? Will black people who are currently enslaved ever be free? The answer wouldn't have been no, it would have been hell no. And you could have asked that at any point from 1622, 3 years after they started the importation, of Africans for the purpose of enslavement. You could ask it in 1743, you could ask it in 1789, you could ask it in 1776. You could ask it any time really up to the early 1800s as the abolition movement began, but there was no guarantee that the abolition movement was going to be successful. The answer would have been not just no, it would have been hell no. And yet, situations and activism and courage, incredible courage, altered the understandings of what was acceptable as far as certain human behaviors and practices, and slavery indeed did fall, at least on paper. So racism and white supremacy still is alive and well as ever, but the thing is enslavement as its primary manifestation did fall. So my feeling is if I know that history, then I have an incredible launching pad, I have an incredible legacy that I can fall back on and I can think. Because one of the things that people also don't understand, white people did not free black people in this country. We had agency. We worked to free ourselves. We were not just passive recipients of proclamations, emancipation proclamations, etc. We were working steadily by, if nothing else, our survival. So that's my legacy, and I'm sticking to it. And we shouldn't clap after every remark. Let's not do that.
But the answers are so good.
No, I don't know if they're good or not, but at least not mine.
I don't know that I can say much more than what Barbara said. For me, I think part of it is that it's the legacy gives us hope, and it also gives us humility, or a grounding for humility. And I feel like that's so important right now, to recognize what kinds of huge amounts of change have happened in different parts of the world, including in this country. And it gives us hope that we can actually make some serious changes here also. I think the one example or one story I want to tell is that the way in which we tell history is so important too. And one of the things that was really impressive, I thought, is that how many of you have heard of the Stonewall movie? There's this movie, somebody did it about Stonewall. The protagonist is a white gay man, and there's not really lead roles. It's primarily a white story. And it actually just opened up in theaters maybe a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weekends ago. And it was a complete commercial flop. And I think one of the things that made that so was that there was a huge boycott, grassroots boycott effort across the country, because the real story of Stonewall was not that white men did Stonewall. What the Stonewall uprisings that people mark as one of the historic moments of queer liberation was really black and Puerto Rican trans women in New York City, homeless young people who rioted against the cops, who rebelled against the cops, who were actually enforcing gender norms. And the fact that we're at a stage right now where the LGBT community can actually have an understanding that it's not okay to completely whitewash history. And a movie like Stonewall won't be a commercial success really speaks to the fact that people know their history and that we're collectivizing the stories that are often not told, the stories of people like Sylvia Rivera or Marsha P. Johnson. And so for me, history in part is about giving us hope, giving us humility, but also giving us grounding because we have all of these ancestors who are still with us, who actually help us move every step of the way. I thought we weren't doing that clapping thing.
You know, I guess I'll take the question in terms of, you know, how we practice this with our young people at Make the Road. You know, we have a pretty vibrant program where we work with our young people. We have the honor of working with them every day, 4 days a week. And then on Fridays, we usually like kick it and hang out and do some cool stuff maybe, or we might just kick it. You know, but one of the things that we do and that we've been doing since we've created the project in 1999 is we've been spending 2 hours a week. Sometimes it goes on for 3 or 4 in what we call power sessions. And power sessions are the political education arm for our youth project. And so on Tuesdays, all we do is have young people think about topics they want to explore. You know, be a part of doing research and writing curriculum and then bringing that to the table. And oftentimes, what that space is a reflection of past movements, not just to remember our history and where we came from, but also to think about what we can learn and how we can, in our own organizing strategies, right? And what we can kind of take, but also what we can leave, what we can do differently. You know, for me personally, my very first power session at Make the Road was an introduction to a film called Pa'lante Siempre Pa'lante, which is a documentary on the Young Lords organization, you know, which was very active in Chicago and then grew its base here in New York City. And you know, outside of the kind of story that I shared earlier, it was really that, right, that kind of made me think about engaging in activism and launching a campaign in the first place, right? The fact that there was these, you know, teenage Puerto Rican kids who engaged in their very first brigade in the streets of New York City, where they simply picked up garbage and set it in the middle of a street and set it on fire because the sanitation department wouldn't come and clean up people's streets, right? And that sparked, right, this garbage offensive in streets across the city. And it wasn't just, right, laying out garbage and setting it on fire, but it was them talking about strategy and talking about how they understood that if the buses, you know, couldn't move up and down particular roads, the city couldn't make money. And if the city can't make money, the city can't thrive. And then it continues, right, in talking about, you know, if you can go after, or if you can, you know, freeze the economy, even if it's for a night, right, the beast wakes up, right? And so it was extremely kind of interesting to me to kind of learn about that at such a young age, right, and think about kind of sophisticated strategies to be able to, you know, to engage in the work and do the work. And so for us, it's a weekly practice. One of the other things that we've been able to do when we engaged in a fight around the closing of Bushwick High School campus was we organized community to be able to start our own school, the Bushwick School for Social Justice. And for many, many years, you know, folks like myself went in and worked with juniors and worked with seniors to be able to bring some of that curriculum into public education, right? To be sure that, you know, we're talking about the Young Lords and the Panthers and other groups, not just in the 4 walls or within the 4 walls of Make the Road, but that we were bringing that to students, you know, a couple blocks away. And so, you know, for us, it's a value. It's extremely important. It's something that we put in practice on a weekly basis.
Given how each of you have shared a small part with us of how you understand, ground yourself, and relate to the legacy and history of activism, can you also share with us from your experiences over the decades, what would you see as some contemporary innovations in approaches to activism?
I think one of you.
Why are we not leaping at that?
So, I mean, I guess, one of the things that I think about and I find really sexy is kind of youth-based participatory research. And it's something that we have been engaging in for a few years now. We've partnered with the CUNY Graduate Center and John Jay College over the last 3 years to think about youth perceptions on police officers. Post the huge boom in stop, question, and frisk that we've seen happen here in New York City, right? We thought about 5 million stops over the course of 10 years and how that impacts young people specifically, right? And not just perceptions, but also realities, right? What were the unintended consequences of some of those stops, of some of those questions? And in fact, one of the things that we see through the data now is we talk about it as the stop, question, and frisk issue in New York City. That's not the way our young people talk about it, right? The young people talk about it as stop, search, and maybe question, right? Officers are stopping me, hands go directly in my pockets, and maybe after they'll ask the questions of where I hid the guns that I just don't happen to have on me in this current moment. And so thinking about, those kinds of strategies and how we're engaging young people in research so that they can be better grounded in thinking about solutions to the problems that exist is something that I think is extremely important. I just got back from a conference in New Orleans, and we were talking about kind of divest, invest, right? So how do we teach communities to study city budgets and state budgets, to pull those apart, and to think about where we're spending money and resources where we shouldn't be, and if the community had control over the spending of some of those dollars, how things might look differently. And one of the young women at the round table was talking about this project, and I think I might get it right, but I think it was called like $1 Million Block. And I think it was an organization in Chicago that wanted to explore block by block how much the state was spending on incarcerating and policing community members who lived on each of those blocks in a particular neighborhood. And what they realized at the conclusion of the study is that there were a ton of blocks in the perimeter that they focused on that were $1 million blocks, where millions of dollars were being spent on policing and incarcerating community members in said neighborhood. And so, those are the kinds of things that I find really cool.
It seems to me that what you find cool is really combining activism with sophisticated policy analysis. In other words, not just looking at what's wrong, but also figuring out what are the practices, the values and the practices that continue to perpetuate what's wrong and how might they be altered. I find that really, very, very fascinating. I was a member of our city council in Albany for 2 terms, from 2006 until 2013, and one of the years that I was on the council, because we had, one of the most bizarre works of fiction masquerading as a budget that one could imagine. But to just put it in context, up until January 1st of last year, January 1st of 2014, Albany had only had 3 mayors since 1941. So that's not even by any definition, is that a definition or does that describe a democracy? Because one of the things that we think happens with democracy is regime change, and we were not having regime change. But in any event, one of the years I was on the Common Council during that, prior, long slog of, 3 mayors, was that a group that I was a part of did something called the People's Budget. And, people studied the budget, people who really know how to read a budget, I'll never claim that I do, despite eight years of having to listen to every single scintilla of information about that fiction called the budget. But in any event, it interests me, like when you talk about things that you find interesting or sexy, things that I resonate with around policy. So that's great.
I think that part of it for me, my silence and not wanting to take the question, put my finger on my nose to say not me, is that it's a hard question, I think, and I think maybe part of my answer, I keep thinking about, there's a quote from one of the essays of the late Black lesbian author and activist Audre Lorde, that goes something like, there's no new ideas, there's only new ways of making them felt. And I feel a little bit like that's my answer to this question. But I do think that there's developments and changes in history and how organizing and activism happens. So one of those, I think, is that I think we've gotten more politically developed in terms of the left of the US and the social justice movements in the US to really start to centralize more the voices of communities that are most affected by particular issues. We're not perfect yet on that, but we're doing it better than we were a few decades ago. I think another development, which is, again, it's not a new tactic, but it's a development, is that we are seeing more direct action around the country in the past year. And that's something that we hadn't been seeing, at least on a national basis, in the way we did see it in this past year in response to all of the police violence that got highlighted. We hadn't seen that, I don't think, on a national scale since probably the early 2000s and the late 90s. And what had converged around the late 90s was really the rise of a youth justice movement with anti-globalization struggles, with a number of different anti-police brutality struggles around the country. But there was so much direct action happening at that time. In New York City, direct action got frozen after 9/11. So after 9/11 in 2001, for those of you who were in New York, how many of you were in New York then? So for those of you who were in New York then, you'll remember the city changed in many different ways, and one of those ways was it was impossible to criticize law enforcement without being equated with being not only anti-patriotic, but really destructive and being completely isolated politically. The other thing that happened, though, was that because of all of the hyper-militarized law enforcement that was around the city at that time, including troopers in the train station, rifles regularly on the streets, folks didn't feel like there was room to do any kind of direct action. Simultaneously, there was a bunch of political surveillance that was happening in the late 90s and early 2000s. So all of those factors together changed the local landscape, and actually some of the national landscape too, in terms of freezing direct action, I think. We've seen that shift dramatically in this past year. I'm hoping that we continue to see that shift, so that the innovations that Jose and Barbara are talking about in terms of thinking creatively about policy solutions, having them work with organizing, that they also have coordination with street-side strategy.
So I want to segue to talking about the anti-police brutality protests of this moment, which has, it seems that the moniker Black Lives Matter is now serving as an umbrella for all of it, even though Black Lives Matter, there's a component that can be a specific group of people working in a particular way. And I want to segue by asking a question which will get at what I hope is some of the hidden history or hidden communities around police brutality organizing. There is a new documentary by Stanley Nelson on the Black Panthers that's been opening across the country in the last few months. Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. And it is striking, many images are striking. One that's particularly striking is one of those big tanks that you used to see in the military, right? In war. It's rolling down the street. It is painted blue. It says police on it in the 1970s. I don't remember in which city. It might have been Chicago, right? Just rolling down the street, and you're making the connection to the tanks that rolled out in Ferguson and elsewhere. But one of the things the movie does, right? Police brutality work and anti-police brutality work is often defined by the white police officer assaulting the black male body. And one of the things that, if you pay attention closely in the movie, you see the ways in which that protest also was a way in which the Young Lords connected to the Black Panthers, that Fred Hampton had made real headway, connected with poor whites in the South who were starting to make a connection to the Panthers at all of the free UHWE protests. Not most of the faces, but a lot of the faces in the camera are white and young and Latino. It's really diverse. And one of the things that struck some of the older activists in the organization that I work with and the protest marches last year was that the people on the street were very young, but also very, very diverse. And it stood at odds with their traditional notions and the traditional activism that they had engaged in police protest. So I wanted to know if each of you could illuminate in your own way how you understand the diversity of communities and peoples who really form this coalition or are part of this anti-police brutality movement, despite the image being one of like a singularly black and black male movement.
Well, I'm thinking about Say Her Name and the efforts of the women, queer-identified women, who started the hashtag Black Lives Matters, and others, who have that kind of connection to reality. It's just about a connection to reality. Women of color are also brutalized by the police and sometimes murdered. But the thing is, from time out of mind, just like the title of the book, there's a book that says, all the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. And just like, that mentality of dividing up, identities as opposed to seeing how they intersect, you don't really get complexity, you don't get complex political understandings if you assume that only one gender is affected by racism and anything that happens to them is exactly the same for their other counterparts, who are members of the racial ethnic group, nationality group. So there's that confusion. And then there's also what I find infuriating too, and this may seem like it's not related, but I think it is, because it's perpetuating wrong-headed thinking. My Brother's Keeper, the initiative out of the Obama White House to address the dire circumstances and situations that young men of color face, very, very laudatory for them to do that, if that's the right word, that's all well and good, but it is based on bad social science. The social science doesn't in any way demonstrate or prove that the young women and girls who live in these very same neighborhoods and in these very same households, that they are significantly better off than their male counterparts. The social science is just not there. And in some cases, girls and young women are doing worse. And yet we have the notion that, and it has manifested in other eras too, like the concept of endangered black men. It's, as I said, we had we've accepted the My Brother's Keeper challenge in the city of Albany, but I basically insisted that it include girls and young women. So our initiative is My Brothers and Sisters Keeper. And at the summit where we were launching it, I said it's not an either-or approach, it's a both-and approach. But that applies, then going back to your question about the need to demystify and demythologize who's actually gravely affected by white supremacy during this time period. It's all, and you know what? It's also people who are not people of color. You live in a destabilized, unfree society because people of color can be dispatched, without any significant repercussions.
Jose and I are having a fight each time about who goes next. I think that I work with a coalition of organizations across the city, Community Center for Police Reform, that represent many, many different communities. And part of what the structure of the campaign is that it's really tried to centralize the different voices and communities who are most affected by the spectrum of police violence. So the way I come at this question, I think, is in part through that experience and in part through, I came into anti-police brutality work through a very multiracial setting in many ways. Part of it was through an organization called CAB, Organizing Asian Communities, which was actually founded in part to combat police violence against Asian communities. And some of it was also the killing of a young man named Yongshin Hwang by the NYPD. But more than that, I think part of what we really need to understand is that policing impacts so many communities. It's incredibly important, I think, to uplift the work of Black Lives Matter. And I don't want to make it seem as if any of us are speaking for Black Lives Matter, the specific network. But there is a moment right now where it's really important to uplift the message that the network and everybody who identifies as part of the movement, which is probably many people in this room, carry, which is more than just being about being against police violence. It's also about affirming the value of Black lives and all of what that means. And so the way it's been talked about, I think, in most circles I'm in, is really a Black liberation movement moment that we can choose to support. And it doesn't mean that that's the only thing that's important. It means that that's a critical piece of how we think about social change today. But going back to Alethia's question, what I think about right now in 2015 is 125th Street. There's all of this policing crackdown happening of people who are homeless right now. And every day, every single week since the summer, the tabloids in the city, the New York Post and the Daily News in particular, every week there's some cover story or some set of photos that are really serving to demonize people who are homeless and criminalize them and make it seem as if all of the city's problems are because these people who are homeless are on our streets. And part of what that's done, I think, is really give license to Commissioner Bratton to go on a war against homeless people. There's fabrications and myths that are being put out publicly saying that there are encampments all across the city. How many of you have seen a homeless encampment in New York City? Where was it? And what are you describing as a homeless encampment?
And probably thinking of now that you're describing.
Tell us what you're thinking.
Like somebody who built themselves a shelter out of cardboard boxes and is seeking shelter.
Sure. So if you've got a piece of cardboard on top of you, that is what the NYPD is calling an encampment, which is actually not an encampment. That's shelter from the rain. That's temporary. It doesn't actually block pedestrian traffic. You can still go around that. And we're in a city where there's an immense housing crisis right now, where people are actually being moved out of homes because they can't pay the rent, where how many of you have tried to move anywhere in New York City and rent an apartment in the past 2 years? It's hard. And people are losing their homes at the same time that there's not actually enough homes there's enough space, but there aren't actually places that are housing programs for people to be able to move into. And so we're in this city of immense wealth right now, where Picture the Homeless, an organization that's run and led by homeless people, has counted vacant lots across the city. And they've assessed that actually, even if you converted those vacant lots, a fraction of those vacant lots, into housing, you could house all the people who are homeless and more on the vacant lots. So we're in this moment of immense contradiction, where the NYPD has decided that what they're going to do is create a whole fear campaign, that there are 80 encampments all across the city. What was just described was one person on a sidewalk, right? That's actually not a huge encampment. That's not something to drive fear. instead of actually acknowledging that we have a housing crisis right now, and many people, more people, are going to become homeless. And we either address that, but we certainly shouldn't be addressing it by aggressive policing. And with the stories we're hearing on 125th Street right now from Picture the Homeless and others there are stories where officers will tell people to move on, move from one block to the next block. And then when they've moved to the next block, they tell them to move again. So if you're sleeping at night, you're being woken up multiple times. Not only that, but officers are telling them to go to the park, where other officers are giving them summonses for being in the park. There's a number of instances where we've heard officers basically not necessarily arresting people, but bringing them to the hospital or psych wards to clear them off the streets against their will. And the hospital and psych wards release them immediately because they don't belong there. So that's the moment we're living in right now. And for what Picture the Homeless says all the time is that that's actually part of what we should be saying when we say Black Lives Matter. Because many of the people who are homeless in New York City are Black specifically, especially around 125th Street. The other example I just wanted to raise is really this question about, I think that the last count that I saw was that there have been 20 trans women of color who've been killed in the United States just this year in 2015 and murdered. And while they have not all been murdered and killed by police, there's a spectrum of police violence that actually means that their murders are not investigated. And that's actually part of what we mean when we say we need police accountability. It's actually to do all of the spectrum of what police functions are deemed to be in a way that's respectful of every community. So many of these incidents of killings have not been investigated, they're not adequately prosecuted, and we're seeing more and more visibility of this, which doesn't mean that necessarily it hasn't been happening for a long time. So I guess those are two examples I just want to raise up that shows some of how diverse the experience of police brutality is for communities.
Yeah, I think Joo-Hyun did a good job at talking about the kind of interconnectedness of the work that we do. And so I see it as that, but I also see it as like the policing of space, right? And so, oftentimes when we talk about policing, we get wrapped up in talking about the, day-to-day interactions between police officers and community members on a street. But the reality is that when we examine the policing of space, right, you can't go anywhere these days without seeing some form of law enforcement, right? So streets are one example. I grew up in public housing, and anytime I go visit my parents, the NYPD is engaging in vertical sweeps from floor 7 to floor 1 to clean hallways. When you look at public safety, just after 2000, the School Safety Administration was handed over from the Department of Education to the New York Police Department. And so you see an increase of school safety agents, but not just school safety agents. You see an increase of armed police officers inside of public schools, even in elementary schools where we're talking about 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds. And you see in-school precincts, right? You see first floor in-school precincts where officers are arresting and detaining young people as early as the age of 5. And not just students, right? There have been cases, for example, of a principal in the Bronx who was arrested for trying to intervene with a police officer who was going to arrest one of his students, right? And so the officer slapped the cuffs, not just on the student, but also on the principal for trying to get in the way. You see it in stores, right? I mean, I was in the city last weekend with my wife, and you go through some of the fancy shops, and you kind of peek in, and you see armed guards, sometimes with rifles, right, protecting the Barneys and all the fancy shops up and down Fifth Avenue. And so, what we're talking about across the city and across the country is policing of public space, right, parks, et cetera, and the list goes on. And I think people are starting to see that, and people are starting to feel like, we're living in a police state, right? We're living in a place where, where we want to feel safe, but this isn't the thing that makes us feel safe. And I guess the last thing to say is really just talking about all of the different groups who I've seen become very active and very involved in the BLM movement, right? In our organization, we have a Globe and Pride committee. And many of the members of Pride in Queens have been on the front lines of actions and protests day and night because of their own experiences up and down Roosevelt Avenue in Jackson Heights, where as trans Latina women, they are stopped, they're questioned, they are frisked, they're searched, and oftentimes they are groped because the officer wants them to prove their gender, right? And so, oftentimes they're arrested and they're stuck in a paddy wagon because the face on the identification or the name on the identification doesn't match what the officer believes that he is seeing at the current moment of the stop, right? And so a lot of our folks in Queens, trans Latina women, have decided this is our struggle, this is our fight, because we're living this day in and day out up and down the streets of Roosevelt Avenue. Our undocumented young people have been on the front lines of the struggle as well. Over the course of the last few years, you've seen a movement of undocumented students coming out and saying, we are undocumented and unafraid, right? We're here, we're not leaving, and we need to work towards comprehensive immigration reform. One of the huge things that we're seeing with immigrant communities is the collaboration between federal ICE and local law enforcement. In fact, we have to call some cities sanctuary cities because they are choosing not to comply with federal guidelines in terms of detaining and passing folks over, right? And so when immigrants, folks who are undocumented see police officers as the gateway to deportation, we have a serious issue, and this becomes their struggle, and this is their struggle. And it's also a struggle for a lot of our parents, right, based on language. And so we have many, many adults who have been on the front lines simply because of the language barriers that exist between them and local law enforcement, right? The fact that they're being told, I don't understand you, speak fucking English, right? Otherwise I'm gonna have to take you in and process you because I don't understand what you're saying, right? Lost my train of thought, but it's just crazy, right? And so for me, I think about it in all those ways, right? Like students and our trans members and our undocumented folks and our parents, and just folks who I think are just fed up, right? Or just fed up with the fact that too many folks who look like them, too many of their neighbors, too many of their family members are being wrapped up in a criminal justice system that we've seen explode over the course of the last 30 years. Mostly for nonviolent offenses. And we know that has detriments not just to particular individuals, but to families and social networks and entire communities. And so I think that's why people are out there and active. And I would challenge the folks who are on the sidelines asking why it's so diverse to just hop in.
I would say for some of those guys, they're in it, and then they're just surprised to see so many other folks that were unfamiliar to them. So thank you for elucidating that. I think at this time it'd be a good moment to start to open up the questions to the audience. Okay, great. And so Caitlin has a microphone, so she'll bring it over.
So this is for each of the panelists. I'd love your comments on social media. Is it a game changer for activism? Or is it just another tool in your toolkit? Or do you not really use it in your work at all?
Yeah, I think we got to use social media responsibly. I think social media is an incredible tool. I think we've seen the amount of work and the amount of reach, even organizationally, that we've been able to have. And that new groups that have formed over the course of the last few years have been able to have. But for me, just one example that I can think of is, I guess two examples, because I have this fight often with our youth organizers, right? I'm doing outreach for the committee meetings, I'm tweeting about it. Or I posted it on Facebook, people will show up, right? And so, one of the things is that social media cannot be a substitute for human interaction and human relationships, right? What brings people in and what keeps people in more than anything else is that relationship. And it's our job as organizers and just as people, as good folk, to go out there and to try and engage and develop and sustain, right, a love for each other, and also just a want to talk to each other, right, a want to be in the same space with one another. The second thing is, I think one of the things that frustrates me when I say responsible social media is, there's some times where I go out to actions and I'm super impressed, awesome, right? And very diligent about creating a structure where you have a team of people who are responsible for social media, who are responsible for tweeting and posting pictures. But I've been to other actions where everyone is tweeting and no one is chanting, right? And so everyone's tweeting about the action, but no one's present in the moment, right? And I feel like sometimes that, and I don't see it too often, but I've seen it, and I feel like sometimes that is a little bit frustrating, right? Like, I want people to be in it. I want folks to feel the spirit. I want folks on the outside to feel like it's something they want to be a part of, something that they want to jump into. And it's hard to feel that way from the outside looking in if everyone's head is in their phone, tweeting that we just hit the corner of Clinton and wherever we are. Pierpont.
That's great. Well, I'm a late adopter, very late. And I'm not on social media, actually. I have a smartphone that I barely know how to use. But we talked about this prior to the panel beginning, and one of you described it as a silly question. Not to say that your question is silly, but the thing is, you actually gave an answer, or gave a possible answer, which is it just another tool in our toolkit? Because whatever era people were organizing in, they were using the state-of-the-art communication mechanisms. So we're enthralled, and that includes myself, with what these tiny handheld computers can do. But the thing is, so were people enthralled at mimeograph machines and manual typewriters, which made things so different than hand copying every single document that people needed. So, as I said, every era, it's hard to believe because, of course, you need to have perspective. But the thing is, every single era uses the state-of-the-art communication methods. And if we think about it that way, then, and we think about the phenomenal things that have been done, like I'm thinking about the resistance, to the Nazis during World War II, for example. No fax machines, no email, none of it. And yet somehow, against the most horrific consequences, people stood up and did what was needed.
I think the only other thing I would add is I think social media is a communications game changer, but not an organizing game changer. And what I mean by that is that it's given us this incredible platform to be able to tell stories that mainstream media just won't cover. And in fact, mainstream media is catching up to social media when stories break. Every good journalist these days, they've got a Twitter account because they're following what the breaking news will be. And we'll hear breaking news, global breaking news or local breaking news on social media faster than we're ever going to hear it from mainstream media, print press, and that sort of thing. So I think in that way it's a game changer on the media and communication side. But the other part is I can't emphasize enough how much I agree with what Jose and Barbara said. It doesn't replace organizing. It doesn't replace relationships. And it can be an incredible tool to help mobilize, but not if there's no basis of relationships to mobilize people or a platform or a strategy that's an organizing strategy beyond that.
I really love social media, just for the record.
My question is for Professor Smith. I mean, first of all, it's amazing to actually see you after having read your work for decades. And so it's just a privilege and a thrill. So thank you.
And thank you for saying that.
Your work, it's just, there really aren't words for it, but I'm glad you gave words to it through the book that you guys did. So I guess I'm really interested. And I guess it's kind of two questions, but it's related to, I guess Black women are kind of at the center of the two questions. One is this interesting dynamic where, on the one hand, and I don't mind admitting that I'm a Beyonce fan, on the one hand you have someone like Beyonce standing on the stage with feminists flashing behind her, and claiming, so one of the most famous Black women in the world, if not the most famous, claiming feminism as part of her identity. And then at the same time, you have this new suffragettes movie, or I can't remember what it's called, with Meryl Streep coming out, where Black women and other women of color once again get erased. So I'm just kind of trying to understand or try to make sense of this paradox of Black women's role in the discourse of feminism, where it's this constant cycle of exploitation and, you know, including exploiting the image of Black women, but often erasing us. And I think the other thing that I'm kind of interested in, and this is related to social media, but I think it's important for Black women as well, is this issue of intergenerational activism. Because I see a lot of tension around young people saying, old people, you don't use social media or you use it wrong. I know I use it wrong. Like, that's not how you do that. You know, you're not doing it right. And kind of ignoring what older people have to teach, and then older people getting frustrated and us kind of saying, you know, oh, you don't know your history, blah, 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 blah. And yet I feel like there's this incredible legacy of intergenerational movements. Even your introduction talked about the intergenerational work that brought you into activism. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, where do Black women fit in this conversation of feminism and intergenerational activism, and how do we make it better than it is right now? Because I feel both hopeful and frustrated.
Well, those are all wonderful questions, and I can't possibly address them all, and us continue to have a dialogue. So I'll just pick, you know, what I think that I might be able to, you know, like address with some, you know, helpfulness. The book has not closed on Black women being marginalized. It is shocking to me, having been where I have been, trying to carve out something called Black feminist movement since the 1970s, and being vilified for that effort, and to see someone like Beyonce have, you know, the letters sky high, you know, as a part of performance, for which he gets cajillions of dollars. You know, you can actually have those words, have the words behind you in sky high letters, and get paid cajillions of dollars because you're Beyonce. It's just like, wow. Yeah, I wish I could live like that. But be that as it may, it's very complicated. It's okay now. What that moment said to me more than anything else is that it's okay now to use the term feminist and be simultaneously Black and female. It's okay now. Now, what the content is another matter. Alethia can verify that I spent the afternoon when I was at her office hanging out until we came to Brooklyn, reading a long article in the New York Times Magazine about Nicki Minaj. And if I was at home, I don't know that I ever would have read the article because I would be too busy, but I just thought, oh, you know, I'm fascinated by her. I've followed her career. I don't really know her music, but I read deeply about popular culture, always have, always will, and I also partake parts of popular culture, not necessarily music, because, you know, not necessarily contemporary music. Be that as it may, I just find it fascinating what passes for female self-empowerment and the, using the B word with impunity, just like the N word is used in certain contexts with impunity. It's just fascinating. You know, I'm glad people are talking about gender roles and sexual politics in a racialized context. I'm happy about that. But whether there's any depth of understanding, I don't know. And just to say one thing about the intergenerational issue, one of the things that I've said about my experience as a young person growing up in the 1960s, and Black, of course, and an activist, I always said that unlike my white counterparts at the same time, I never felt that Black youth who were militantly activists were rebelling against their families and their parents. They realized that their problem was not likely, or most likely, what their parents and their family members were up to. That was not the problem. The problem was systematic oppression, both racial and economic. And it was just really different, you know. So you're the same age as the people sitting next to you in the meeting. You're the same age as the people in the streets demonstrating. You're the same people, same age, you know, wherever you were doing the work, and yet your point of view was very, very different, at least out of my experience at that time. And I think historically there's been a lot of respect for elders in the African American community historically. But again, another conversation that Alethia and I had this afternoon was about respectability politics, as it is termed, and what's not understood about the era in which so-called respectability politics were being practiced to the detriment of who I do not know. Longer discussion.
Thank you so much for everything tonight. So the question I have is, I know that Professor Smith brought up, like just the idea that, you know, white supremacy being well and alive, and then thinking about my own like relationship with activism and being a person of color and trying to organize. I'm a school teacher, and so trying to organize, especially in the classroom space, around teaching and learning in ways that are culturally like positive, relevant, and responsive, and then kind of continually running into the issues of trying to organize with people who, in this like kind of current historical moment of like post-racial weirdness coming out of like multiculturalism of the 90s or whatever, you know, all these kind of like weird eras of how we're going to deal with this really intense problem. I find myself like once again just really confused about how to organize specifically with white activists and also just with white people in general. And I'm curious about your experiences or feelings around that, especially in this like kind of present moment where there's almost an entire generation of folks who are growing up in like a post-racial world, huge quotes around that, and like their kind of political sensibilities or sense of history is also damaged or erased. So I'm just curious about your guys' perspectives on that as activists in the current moment.
Post-racial. Ahistorical.
I think you want to say, you go.
Oh, no, I don't want to, no, I'm not going to answer 2 questions in a row. That's not happening, people. So.
When you said the word multicultural, that's actually one of my earliest memories of meeting you, Barbara, which was, I mean, I think you were somewhere and you're like, I hate that word. Oh, yeah. And part of it is because it doesn't actually acknowledge racism. It doesn't actually, you don't have to be against white supremacy to be in favor of multiculturalism. Yeah. And multiculturalism doesn't have any meaning in terms of confronting power and confronting inequality. So I think that it's, I'm having a reaction to the word, not because of you, but just because of the word. But I do think that this moment right now, while the country, some parts of the country believes this myth of being post-racial, I think that what this last year has helped to highlight actually is that racism is so deeply embedded and ingrained in U.S. economy and U.S. structures and U.S. policies. And hopefully people who are just becoming active in this past year and ongoing are coming into a movement that actually has racial justice at its core. We have a lot more work to do in terms of how to practice anti-racism, but ideally, more and more of the spaces that we're in are trying to do that. I think a lot of our spaces are not doing it well, but it's an acknowledgement that's a little bit different right now because the current movement moment in many ways is a reaction to a growing awareness that there is a serious national problem around race, even if people won't say it's racism.
Jose, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I don't know. You know, sometimes your brain's going in a ton of different directions. I mean, the thing that it made me think about, like Joo-Hyun's comments, is just kind of digging into, the new Jim Crow and kind of Michelle Alexander's comments about, what we've seen through this prison explosion, right? And the fact that, like, it's, she talks about that it's, no longer permissible to use race explicitly as justification for discrimination and exclusion, and so oftentimes folks don't. But what is permissible is to use the criminal justice system to dub folks as criminals for not doing anything other than being them, right? And then engaging in the same practices that we used to engage in historically, right? And so it's totally still legit to discriminate against those same folks as it once was against, black folk in the Jim Crow South. And so, I guess that's the thing that kind of comes up for me, right, is thinking about, that question of race, and do we talk about it or do we don't? But the reality is there, right? Like, it's just like, it's in your face all the time, and just a quick look at, right, who are the folks being over-policed, who are the folks falling into the criminal justice system, right? Who are the folks getting suspended and getting wrapped into the criminal justice system through the school-to-prison pipeline, right? And what that means. I think that's all, like, real stuff. And so, I guess I'll leave it at that.
The fact that 9 black people were slaughtered in church at a Bible study back in, it was June, right? In Charleston, South Carolina. Talk about pulling the scales away from people's eyes so they can see what's really going on here. And I was on one of our highways in Albany earlier this week, and in front of me is a pickup truck with a big Confederate flag. Not the first time I've seen such, but we're north of you, and we're in the north here, and we're definitely in the north of you, up in the capital region. It's not over. There's a book, however, that I've been recommending to people who are interested in looking at the issue of racism from a certain point of view. It's called Waking Up White. It's by Debbie Irving. Has anybody heard of it? So she has been a classroom teacher, and the book is fascinating because she is a woman in her early 50s now, or maybe mid-50s. She did not really find out what country she was living in and what was going on here until 2009. She took a course in racism and culture or something like that at Wheelock College in Boston, where she was working on a master's in education. And she had always wanted to have better relationships with people of color, always wondered why it only went so far, went a certain distance but no further. One of the things about the book, it's very readable. She's very unsparing and self-critical about what she doesn't know and the mistakes that she makes. The chapters are very short. It's well written. The chapters are very short, and at the end of every chapter, there's either an exercise or a set of questions to help you position yourself in relationship to what she's writing about. It's not necessarily a book aimed at people of color, obviously, but the thing is that it's encouraging for those of us who are people of color to find out, and to, whenever we find out that some white people actually have gone there and want to try to change dynamics. It is almost a completely apolitical book. So I will warn you about that. She does not look at systems necessarily. She hits on some really, really important examples of how systems oppress, but the thing is her consciousness is not in that realm. But it's still an interesting book, just something to put on, like for those who are in denial, particularly, it might be a good book. And I want to just take my hat off to you as a classroom teacher, because you're our heroes, I believe.
So I want to do a time check and find out how much more time we have remaining in the program.
It's after 8.
Is it? I don't have a.
Hi, sorry, I'm back here. I'm also a teacher, and
Great.
actually, you don't need to clap for me. I teach in Brooklyn, but I actually wanted to share a story with you, and I was really struck by this moment, and it's something that I think has defined my experience since. So I have an advisory in my school where we talk about social issues, and especially after Eric Gardner was in the media, I showed the video, and most of my students hadn't seen the video. And I asked them for their reaction. And I tried to be as objective as possible in the way that I showed the video so that I wasn't tainting their reaction, because I obviously have an opinion, but I wanted to hear theirs. And immediately the reaction was, why was he doing that? And he's a really big black man, so he really shouldn't have been fighting back. He shouldn't have been talking back. He should have known better than that. And immediately, I did not anticipate at all that that would be the reaction. And when I asked them if the same thing would have happened if it was a white man in his place, they said, no, I don't think that has anything to do with it. So I was completely taken aback. And I had the realization over the course of my last year and this year teaching that what you were talking about before with youth and uprisings and movements that are ignited by youth, I don't see in my schools. And I don't see that consciousness in my schools. And I don't see it in my students. And it really scares me, because what's happening now, especially in that moment when I showed the video, I thought it would make them really angry and ignite a discussion about social justice. And instead there was apathy, and most students said, Miss, this happens in my neighborhood all the time. So I don't really know why we're watching this video. It doesn't really mean anything to me. So I wanted to get your reaction to that, because it's something that makes me feel really powerless, and it's something that I struggle against, and I'm trying to really grapple with it as a public school teacher in New York City.
So, I mean, I don't know where you teach, and I don't know your students, but I do know that it's there, right? I think that might just be an example of a blip on the radar. And this is the kind of work, and it's these kinds of conversations, right? It takes process, it takes time. But where do you teach?
I teach at Brooklyn Prep, so I'm actually in Williamsburg, but my students are from all over Brooklyn. So they come from Canarsie,
What's the original back?
Flatbush, all over. So most of them are from Williamsburg. They can
Is it high school? High school. I would love to come to your advisory.
You can come talk to my girls. I mean, those are my girls last year. They still come to my lunch club, and it's still the same. I mean, it's really hard to try to break through, but it's really, really hard.
Yeah, you know, Williamsburg is right next door to Bushwick, and so we're close, and so we should chat, because I'd love to make it happen. That's my answer.
That's great. That's a great answer.
So I'm wondering, just to close out and wrap up, activism is about change, small changes, changes in communities and people, and systemic change. But I wonder, if we're closing out, if each of you wouldn't mind commenting briefly about thinking about your journey as an activist in the decades that you have in the game. What are some of the ways that you've changed in how you engage in the practice of activism?
Well, one of the major changes in my life is that I became an elected official. So, completely sold out. I have done a presentation that's titled, when I do talks at different places, it's titled Black Feminism, My Next Chapter. And I talk about how, like, the day of my first swearing in, back in late 2005, like, I was joking with my friends, and I would say to them, how can I stick it to the man if I am the man? And of course, I never in my wildest dreams thought I would get involved in city government. My politics actually did not change. I still have the same core beliefs, and also continue to be involved in activism of the grassroots. Well, the term progressive is used, but I'm a progressive, but I'm also a leftist and a radical. But the thing is, as I said, like, my core politics never really changed. I took inspiration from people in other countries, where sometimes people like Arundhati Roy, have run for political office. Those are my role models. They're a set of people who, don't make me feel like it's something that I should be ashamed of. But that's a difference, between, now and 20 or 30 years ago. And one of the things, I was talking to someone just last night who I've known since the 70s, and we've always been involved in grassroots activism. And I was saying that one of the things that's somewhat gratifying about being involved in the system or in government is that sometimes you can actually see the change come about, like when you were talking about that budget appropriation. Like, that's so concrete, it was going to be this amount, 63 million or whatever, and then you got it for incarceration. And through your efforts, there's a number attached to it, there's an amount, etc. But the thing is, like, my heart is always with, those who are leaders and people who are multiply oppressed and speak out and fight back.
You guys all saw that. I think probably two ways I've changed. One is that I'm much less likely to ascribe to kind of like a politics of purity. I think about things a little bit more complicated now, which I'm struck by what Barbara said. I don't think my core beliefs have changed. I think they've deepened, but I'm more humble about how to think about politics and how we talk about politics. The second thing I think is that I think I've shifted some in terms of being open to other kinds of tactics that I wouldn't have been open to in my teens and 20s. I would have thought that stuff like voter registration, who cares? I still sometimes am a little bit like voter registration, who cares? I'm sorry, because Jose leads our electoral work. But I understand more that actually the idea of these different kinds of tactics, especially if they're brought together and coordinated in a strong strategy that doesn't compromise on principles, can be incredibly powerful, and that we actually need multiple tactics. So.
Yeah, I guess, for me, the obvious thing is I got older. My face changed. And I've never ever had another job. Like, I've never had a job interview, right? Like, I started at this organization, I was 13 years old. I'm 29 years old now. And what I was given at the organization was a tremendous amount of love and nurturing and knowledge, but also opportunity to be able to grow. My job is a very, very different one now. I was a base organizer for many, many years. Now I'm the director of organizing, and I have to manage this massive operation at an organization that has 17,000 members. And I don't know that I know how to do that. We'll figure it out, right? But in a lot of those transitions, right, working with young people, working with adults, moving from youth leader to kind of organizer, right? I think really for me, the biggest learning and the biggest change has been throughout that process, trying to understand my role in that space, right? And the fact that maybe when I was 13, 14, and 15, it was my role to take up space. It was my role to feel like I needed to make all the decisions, right? It was my role to do those sorts of things. And now I kind of, my role is just about asking the right questions 90% of the time, right? Like, how do I create opportunity and space, but also give nurturing and love the way that I received it, so that I can help organizers in our shop grow and come to answering a lot of the questions, a lot of their own questions, right? And provide them opportunity and resource to be able to kind of explore and be creative, still meet the goals, but be creative, right? And so it's been it's interesting, right? Because I wake up every morning and I think I think about am I doing in my current position, am I doing the work that I want to be doing, right? Like, do I want to be a manager? Or do I want to just be a base organizer? And do I want to go out and knock doors every day? And of course, the answer is I want to do both, but that gets really complicated. So.
Thank you. Thank you all, to all of you, and to the Brooklyn Historical Society for hosting this event.